My name is Grace Eiko Thomson. I was born Eiko Nishikihama, but Nishikihama was a terrible name to grow up with in Canada. Every time I mention my name, I have to spell it out. And then, of course, Eiko was my teacher in grade one, especially in post-war. Just mispronounced it all the time, called it Ayoka and all this kind of thing. So one day my mother said, let's give you an English name, because I would come home almost in tears. Oh, he did it again. He embarrassed me again. So then my mother suggested Grace, which was a name that she knew through a friend, an old friend in Vancouver. So I became Grace, and it's done well for me, yeah. So I was born in Steveston Fishermen's Hospital. In those days, a lot of Japanese Canadians were born there because that was a Japanese-run hospital. And I grew up, the first 8 years of my life was in Vancouver. First at 522 Powell Street, and then at 510 Alexander Street. And 510 Alexander Street was quite close to the Japanese language school. And I went to the language school for 2 years. And I went to the Strathcona Elementary School for 2 years, when in 1942, we were uprooted from our homes, and all Japanese Canadians or anybody of Japanese ancestry were moved by the city, not by the city and the province and the federal government, but mainly the federal government, from our homes and sent to what they called an internment camp. Yeah, my parents, my father came to Canada when he was only 19, and I can't remember exactly what the date was, but his two older brothers were already fishing in the coast, and when he turned 19, finished his school, he was so happy to come and join his brothers. But when he came, the brothers said, no, you're not going to go fishing. You're going to go to learn English. And so my poor father had to go on his own. He's at 19, and went and worked at as a houseboy, picked up elementary English, and then started on the going east on the railway tracks, working on the railway, I suppose, and then ended up in Winnipeg. And in Winnipeg, he worked at the Royal Alexandra Hotel, yeah, in the dining room. And I can't find the photo that my mother used to have, but there was one of him sitting in the dining room with another co-worker. And I think that those years were fun years for him, because I remember seeing another photo of him sitting in a convertible with another young man. So I think that they were having a great bachelorhood there. Yeah. And so then when he was 27 years old, that would be about 1929, he was called home to Japan. His parents were living in his background was in Miyomura in Wakayama-ken, the Wakayama prefecture. And so he was called home to marry, an arranged marriage. And so there was an arranged marriage, and my mother, who was only 18, but in those days, women married young, and but she also came from a family of her father having been to Canada. Her father was apparently he was when he was young, sent to marry a woman who had lost her husband, and but had only daughters. Therefore, in order to maintain the family name, he was asked to marry the woman. And because he was a younger son and didn't have to worry about his name being maintained, he went to this family and he became a Yamamoto. And but sadly, I don't know what his original name was. But so the Yamamoto name was maintained in this family, but they had only daughters. But then he had after he had lived there for a little while, I think he got tired of it because they were a miso factory, and so he decided to, when he heard about the New World, that he decided to come to Canada. And so he left his family and came to Canada. And while he was working in Canada, his two sons that he had raised in Japan, they were babies when he left, but they joined him. And he left them to work. And those two sons continued to remain in Canada, in fact, in Steveston. And in fact, those two brothers are under the name of Yamamoto. They're both gone now, but I think they're still well known there. So anyways, my grandfather, after his sons joined them, he went back to Japan. And so my mother was a Yamamoto, and she was only 18 when she was married, you know. And my grandfather, after being in Canada for a while, his wife had passed away, and the two sons came to Canada, and then he returned to Japan and remarried. And my mother and her two sisters are the product of that marriage, the second marriage. So when she was 18, she was married by my father in 1930, December 1929, they moved to Canada. My mother's only 18, remember, and this was in 1930. So in 1942, when Japanese Canadians were removed from the coast, she had 5 children. In those days, everybody had big families, I guess. But anyways, she had 5 children, and only 12 years after coming to Canada, my mother was a very educated woman. She was very fortunate because her father had raised money in Canada, so he was able to raise his 3 daughters to be educated. So my mother knew nothing but education in those days. And of course, education means women's education. So my mother, as I say, came to Canada when she was only 18, but then with 5 children, 12 years later, she was uprooted from her home in Vancouver, where she thought she was going to have a great life. And I'm sure she had great dreams when she came to Canada, but she was, together with I should say too that my oldest sister was at that time visiting grandmother in Japan. So 4 children, my parents, we moved to the gold mine, lost gold mine town of Minto Mines. So anyways, this was the earliest family portrait that we have. And this portrait shows me sitting on my father's lap, no hair. And the reason why there's no hair is because my mother tells me my hair was shaved. Why? Because when my hair started to grow in, it was light brown and curly. And that is not acceptable in a Japanese family. So that is why I have a naked head. And then that's my older sister, who in 1951 returned to Canada, but she was raised in Japan, visiting my grandmother before the war and didn't come back. And then I have a second photo of the family. In those days, family photos were taken because they were sent to Japan, to the grandparents, to show how not only that we are now a family, but also that to show our well-being. And here's a second photo taken in Vancouver, and I'm the second daughter here, and now I have two brothers. And and at that time, of course, my father was working as the buyer for Codfish Fishery Society. So he had a very good job, and we were expecting to have a good life. Yeah. And then I want to show you one more, because I want to show you a photo that was taken. It seems that in those days, family photos were important. And I think it was mainly because we sent them overseas to the grandparents. Now, this photo is one that was taken in Minto mines where we were interned. And it's incredible to think that my parents even looked for a photographer there to get a proper picture of the family. So here we are. My older sister's not with us, but I'm standing there, and I would say that I'm about 10. And then my two brothers, Toyoaki, the name Toyoaki was difficult, so he became Tom. And just like my father, his name was, Japanese name was Tora Saburo, that indicates that he was born the year of the Tora, tiger, and Saburo is the third son. So Tora Saburo and Toyoaki is Tom now. And then my younger brother, the youngest brother, Kenji, and Keiko. Keiko is now married to Artemiki, but she was 40 days old when my mother carried her to the internment site. So in Vancouver, when we were living my first 8 years in Vancouver, I went to the Strathcona Elementary School till grade 2, and then I went to the Japanese language school. And in our home life, of course, with my parents being Japanese immigrants, we spoke Japanese. And my mother was very careful that we maintained the language. Coming to Canada, she knows that English is the first language, so we had to make sure that when we got home, that we always spoke Japanese. And my mother was very much into good manners, so when we're leaving for school, we say "itte mairimasu," and that means we're going now. And then when we return home, we say "kairimashita" or whatever. I forgot the return. And then when we were going to eat dinner, "itadakimasu," and then "gochiso-sama" at the end of the food. So my mother was very strict about things like that. So and at home, the language was always Japanese. And but at the same time, that was in Vancouver, and that was not difficult to do, because Vancouver, when we were living in Vancouver, that area around Powell Street was a thriving community of Japanese immigrants. Now, the question could be asked, why? And in those days, we were living in a society that in which we were all discriminated as Asian immigrants, and so therefore, I think that was a safe environment for us to live in. And also the real story is that the earliest men who came to Canada, the immigrants, worked at Hastings Mill. And by working at Hastings Mill, little by little, the little pubs and restaurants and shops and an advisory center, all those things started to develop because there were men working in that area. And then soon there would be women joining them, marrying them, and then a community formed. And so the Powell Street area became a town. And then, of course, centered around the Powell ground, which we called, which is today called Oppenheimer Park, but we just called it Powell Ground in those days. There was, baseball teams formed and everything, and there was a lot of community gatherings at that park. And then there were young children were taught odori, dance, and martial arts, and so became totally a thriving community. And this was a community. This park was used in those days too by non-Japanese as a place for union rallies, for instance, protest rallies. So this was a very significant area in Vancouver where a lot of activities were held. But anyways, by the time when we were forced to move out of this area in 1942, it was a totally thriving community. You name it, we had it. Even taxi services came out of there. And flower shops, confectionaries, fish shops, all these, everything to maintain Japanese families was there. So it was very sad when in 1942 we were forced out of there, and in returning after restrictions were lifted to come to look at where we used to live, it was an abandoned place. Even today, it's still an abandoned place. And so that was a very sad experience for Japanese Canadians, even though upon returning, they did plant sakura trees, the cherry blossom trees in the park to remember that history. It was still a major shock to them to see the town that was flourishing to be gone, Yeah, I think our home life was very much a Japanese home life, because you have to remember that my mother was a Japanese immigrant coming when she was only 18, and as well that living in that area, she's surrounded by other Japanese immigrants. So every day our food was rice in a bowl, and as I say, we were very formally done, in the sense that we had to always say itadakimasu and pick up the chopsticks and eat the rice, and of course food that was cooked was very much a Japanese style food, and if there was some kind of a celebration, then there would be really a nice sukiyaki or whatever. We didn't eat beef as much because we were so connected with fishermen. My uncles were fishing, so we were getting fresh fish pretty regularly. So the Japanese way of cooking the fish was very much like the way you cook the sukiyaki. Instead of the beef in a soy sauce a mix of stock, you cook a salmon. And that was very big, and that was usually a sort of a Sunday dinner or whatever. The other thing was maze gohan. Well, that was rice that was cooked with bits of chicken and carrots, bits of it. And so maze gohan was very big. And of course, miso shiru, miso soup. Those were regular food. And in most Japanese families, I think that even breakfast was rice. But in my family, because my father had lived in Canada for many years before he married, we always had toast and marmalade, because my father was into marmalade in those days, and we didn't know of any other jam. And so the food that my father, well, for instance, on a Sunday morning, my father would say, wake up to us. And when we get up, I could smell pancakes. My father always made pancakes for us on Sunday mornings. He used to like working in the kitchen, but he had already experienced all these Western things. So I think that our family was a bit different from other families. Yeah. And my mother learned all those things, but left it up to my father to, so our table always had different things that was more Western than Japanese. Yeah, yeah. I think, as I say, I spent the first 8 years of my life in Vancouver, and during that time, interestingly, even though my parents, coming from Japan, would be based in Buddhism, my parents were not that keen on it, and sent me and my older sister to the Japanese United Church on Powell Street. And this was a church that was, the minister was Reverend Shimizu, and then there were Sunday schools there. And I think the reason why my father chose us to go there instead of the Buddhist church, because there were Buddhist churches, and young kids were going there too. The Buddhist church would be all Japanese language. The Japanese United Church had non-Japanese teachers, so it was all done in English. So I think that my parents sent us there to make sure that we were ready for elementary school. And I think that when I think about it now, I think that my father, having lived in Canada already, I think that chose to make sure that his children were prepared for going to an English language elementary school. But it's not the best photo, but this is a photo of the language school. Actually, this is at the Japanese United Church, but this is a graduation from kindergarten. So it's not the greatest photo, but I think that it's dated June 21st, 1939. So I was born in 1933, so I would be 6. It's a graduation, yeah. Yeah, when we moved to Minto, of course, it was a big shock, getting rid of all your the things that you owned. My mother, I remember when we were moving, I sold her kitchen stove, and the reason why my mother looked so sad and unhappy about during that time, I thought was because she had just bought the new kitchen stove. It was a new electric stove, and so I thought that was the reason why she was upset, because what we did is we moved to our uncle's home in Steveston, and moved with our uncle to the internment site. So my uncle had a home in Steveston, so he asked us if we would go with them because he was alone. His family was in Japan at that time. So what happened is that we kind of left the home in Vancouver and moved to Steveston. So as I say, I thought that my mother was upset because she just recently sold the stove. And I didn't really know what was going on, except that we were moving. And we moved to Steveston, and my uncle was meeting with his friends in Steveston, deciding where to go to, which internment site that we would choose to go to. And so because my uncle was talking to his established fisherman friends, they chose Minto Mines, because Minto Mines was one of the self-supporting internment sites, which means that anybody who went there were paying for their own transportation and had to pay rent in the space that they were living in, even though they were uprooted from their home and sent to these sites. So my mother says today, not today, but since post-internment, she often would say, we had no business going to a place like that. We were young and barely making ends meet, and we go with my brother-in-law, his choice of going to an internment site that is self-supporting. And so they had to pay, well, in those days, $6 a month or something. But still, that $6 is a lot. So my mother complained about it after, yeah. And this is another thing, too, of course, that my mother had to deal with not only my father, but my father being the younger brother, and always kind of having to sort of bow his head to his older brothers. So my mother used to kind of complain about that too, yeah. Well, Minto was a beautiful place. If you were going for holidays, you might go there, because you're surrounded by beautiful mountains and everything. And it was a town. It was a lost gold mine town. So it had homes on proper streets and everything. So people who got there early rented those nice homes. So, and not only that, when people went to other internment sites, they took one suitcase full of things to go to the government internment sites. Well, if you went to a place like Minto, the self-supporting sites, you could take whatever you want because you're paying for the cost of moving. So even though my parents didn't take anything because they had already got rid of everything before they moved to Steveston, so the home that we had was, and because we got there a bit late, they had to drag a house from the outskirts that was abandoned by gold miners. And it was a big house, roomy enough, but we had no furniture, so furniture was all built. And we were given beds and things by the government, I think. But other people, my friends who were living there, some people, they even brought their piano, and sat on sofas. So what they did is that they took everything they had in their home in Vancouver and moved there because they were paying for the cost. So those people lived there, and then except for the fact that they're not making money while they're there, but paying rent and all that, but they were already established, so they were fine. But whereas my parents were young, and they were only in Vancouver, married for only 12 years when this happened to them. So, but in Minto, it was sort of like living in Powell area, in that it was all Japanese, of course, because that's an internment site. And my parents were, my father got a job soon after we moved there in a sawmill nearby, in Divine, I think it was called, the place. Well, anyway, so that helped to pay the rent and all that. And then all around the neighborhood, wherever there was an empty space, it became a garden. And so they raised all their vegetables and everything. And I remember we had a basement of the house where these things were kept through the winter. And as I say, it was a beautiful sight for children. We wake up in the morning and we see a family of deers in our garden that we have to shoo away because they're eating our vegetables. But it was really, for children, we were playing with other children. We had no problem. And my mother, too, she was gardening with friends speaking in Japanese. And my father came home every day from working in the sawmill nearby. And I remember my mother feeling happy when she opened his lunch pail, and inside there would be mushrooms he had picked during his break. And so there's a lot of nice things about it. And the other is that parents, my mother's and her new friends, they would get together and make miso and things, like, make Japanese ingredients that's lacking in their, so they learned how to make those things like miso. And then, of course, schools opened soon after, and there's a picture of me in a school, and the teacher is a university graduated man, not a teacher, but anybody with education was selected to become teachers. The ones who taught the younger grades, or grade ones and that, were not properly educated, but still, the government didn't provide it, except that they provided I think that they provided the materials. And so that here, the teacher that I had was Mr. George Tamaki, who was a university-educated man. So we sort of, in those about 3 years that we lived there, we lived a pretty normal life, and we would have picnics by the water. There was a beautiful area where the Gun Creek, it was called. We used to have school picnics there, and there would be races and things like that they did, and then I think that the older students and that some of them could apply to go outside to go to high school and things. So I don't really know how that worked, but I heard that they were able to. And during that period that we were living there, of course, at home it's always Japanese, and my mother wanted to maintain Japanese language. But outside of home, with children, we're going to a school that were speaking English. So between children, we were all speaking probably a mixture, but largely English. Yeah, so I think that we were getting accustomed to speaking English. But of course, we already were speaking English in schools before the war, before the internment. And but my parents too, they were always meeting with other Japanese friends. But the interesting thing too is that because people chose to come to Minto on their own, there were people, the Japanese immigrant people were from different prefectures from Japan. So they spoke in different dialects. And but it was kind of nice for them because they had to mix and got to know each other more. Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, in 1945 is when the war ended. And as the war was ending in the late 1944, we moved out of Minto. And we decided my father decided we will go to Manitoba. And this was before the war ended. And then when we went to Manitoba, we went to rural Manitoba, and for 1 year lived on, in fact, the home that the government gave us was a barn. And incredibly, a barn that the walls were still covered with manure. And my mother speaks about it in her diary, that she couldn't believe it. My family with 4 children are supposed to live in this barn. And so my mother started cleaning and everything. So we stayed there for only 1 year. And during that time, my parents worked on the farm. And my parents had never worked in a farm before, so it was not easy for them. And then they were taking my baby sister with them, and she would be sitting at the end of the row while they hoed the row. And then myself, only 11, 10 or 11 then, no, I think I was 11, with my 2 brothers. We were in the barn, and my parents would come home for lunch, and I would have sandwiches ready. Can you imagine that? I mean, I can hardly imagine that myself now. But I would be preparing the lunch, and they would be coming home for lunch. And my 2 brothers are running wild around the barn, and, because my 2 brothers, if I'm 11, then my brother next to me is 8, and the brother next to that would be 5. Because when the school started this was in Middle Church, Manitoba, I took my 2 brothers, and it was about a quarter of a mile away, the school. So we would walk the highway, and my brothers were, registered in the school, and my youngest brother started school there. And while we were living there, we would, as I say, walk the quarter-mile highway. And some days when we're coming home, we would say to my mother, "Oh, we were so lucky today, we got a lift." And then whenever a car stopped, we jumped in. I mean, that's how safe we felt. We didn't know anything about, And my mother would say, "Oh, you were so lucky. There's always some good people around," which was true. There was some good people around because we were, where our faces showed that we were Asians, not. And so that's where my brothers started pretty well school, because my brother next to me started his school in Minto, so he didn't have that outside connection. And but we stayed there only a year, and then my father found a job in a place called Mosper, which was close to the town of Whitemouth. So we moved to Whitemouth, which was a larger town with grocery stores and everything. And that's when I first realized that people were nice. We didn't feel that discrimination that I felt when I was in Middle Church. And that in Middle Church is where I got my name Grace, because every day I would come home complaining to my mother that my teacher embarrassed me again today because he wouldn't pronounce my name properly. So as I say, we went to Whitemouth, and we stayed there for over 3 years. I made my first real friends there. And then with the end of the, it wasn't just the end of the war, because at the end of the war it meant nothing to us because this restriction was still there. And so when the restrictions lifted, I think that was in 1948, and so in 49 we moved to Winnipeg. And of course, my father, having experienced Winnipeg in his younger days, it didn't feel like he was going to a strange place. But for for all of us, of course, it's a strange new place. And already there were some Japanese families living there. And one family was a family named Otsus. Otsus were big fishermen families in Steveston before the war. And Mr. Otsu was a good friend of my uncle's. So their children were already there, and they helped me to get settled there. And I started high school there. And when I started high school there in the North End, we were told the North End High School is the best one for us because it was largely Jewish. And when I went there, it's interesting because they were largely Jewish, but there were a lot of Scandinavians. And Scandinavians were having a bit of a difficulty settling. I don't know why, but they were there too. And so that's where I started my school years. And I think for the first time I felt, well, it's incredible that up until then I was living not in a normal community. So even going to high school, I'm dealing with people who are totally Canadians. For instance, when we have our physical education, they're all, they know all the sports and everything. It's the first introduction to me of any of the sports. And I remember looking at all the things that were happening there, and they even in the is it PTA class, they would have the teacher would have ballroom dancing and everything. Well, I never knew anything about those things, so everything was new, and so I was only there for about 2 years. So for me, I was a total stranger to all these things. And even to making friends, because I didn't have friends outside of the school classroom, because when I came home, I was living over the Salter Bridge, like, the school was in the north end, so we would take the bus, and because the bus was expensive, finally my parents bought me a bicycle. And what I did is I would come home after school, and I would have to, it was my job to watch for my younger brothers and my sister to come home from school, and even wash the rice and get ready, because my mother was working in a sewing factory at that time. My father also was working for a sterling fur company, and they were both owned by Jewish businesses. So the Jewish community was very kind to us. Yeah. In those days, of course, even though there were already people, even when we were in Whitemouth, we knew of Japanese immigrants, not immigrants, Japanese internees living who had gone to Toronto instead of to the internment sites. There were a lot of young people who were already coming to Winnipeg to go to university, because the University of in Manitoba opened before a lot of the other universities. So young men were coming to Winnipeg, going to university, largely engineering. But in those days, university was not anything that I could even consider. My parents were waiting for me to work to help them. And so soon after so therefore, in those days too, in high school, you took matriculation or commerce. And I took commerce, and I took typing and shorthand, things like that. And so after school, after high school, I got a job in an insurance company, and everybody looked at me with awe, because I don't think any of the employees ever saw an Asian face. and I remember, but they were all very kind. And I can't even think of, when I started working, I can't even think of one person who was not kind. And so I started working in the insurance company, and that was to help my parents as they're working hard, hoping to buy a house. So being the oldest one in the family, my older sister not back yet, she came back in 1951, I think it was. Anyways, I was working, and whatever money I earned went to my parents, and towards hopefully buying a house, which they eventually did. And so by the time they were ready to buy the house, I was feeling a little bit more free. And but this is where I made friends through my work, and so I didn't know many Japanese friends, but there was a lot of Japanese Canadian activities. Young people's not young people. They had different Niseiets and all this kind of community groups forming, and they had dances and all that. And I remember the first time my friend, my young friend, Otsu, family friend, she and I going to one of those, and were kicked out because we were only 15. And they said, come back when you're 16. So I remember those kinds of things, trying to kind of fit into things. And interestingly, in those days, we were still dealing with the Japanese Canadian communities. But in the 1950-51, when we moved to Winnipeg, was the year of the major flood. And I remember joining some friends to go sandbagging. So that's how we started our community connections to Winnipeg. And Winnipeg being a much more multicultural city than Vancouver. Vancouver is very British, whereas Winnipeg was very Eastern European immigrant families, as well as a large Jewish community. I would say that we were treated much better, and And I think that they understood what happened to us and how we got there. And so we had, I think that our parents settled there quite easily. And as I say, we had rented a house from a Jewish family, and we rented, my parents were working in Jewish workplaces. So, yeah, so Winnipeg probably was a good place for us to restart. Because Winnipeg was, when we moved to Winnipeg, we were living in a more mixed community, like not like Vancouver, where you were living in a Powell Street area where you were all Japanese. Winnipeg, we were living in the larger community, and my friends were from work and all that. And so even though I was going to Japanese Canadian activities, I was also living in the larger community, and some of my best friends were non-Japanese. And so living in that kind of area, I was much more, and then getting these jobs too. People were very kind to me, and so I didn't have any feeling of discrimination in those days. And of course, one of the jobs that I got was with a company that hired a lot of Japanese men, and that was a cast iron foundry called the Anthony's Imperial, where a lot of Japanese Canadians got a job. And I was hired there as a stenographer, and then I became a secretary to the boss. And the boss was a really kind man, and he would be so helpful to me. And it's interesting when I think about it, because I didn't know English well. Like, I'm speaking English, but like, for instance, one time when he was dictating a letter to me, he says something was not his cup of tea. And I said, I beg your pardon? And he had to explain to me. And every time anything like that happened, he was so kind and explained things to me. He and his wife took me to the Bomber games and to the Winnipeg Symphony. Like, they really tried to help me to adjust myself into this community. So that was where I got re-educated. And that company, when I was working in that company, a young engineering student worked there, and non-Japanese, and he and I got married eventually. In those days, it was very interesting because Japanese Canadian young people, many of them were started because they're living in the larger community, might be dating someone other than from their own community, and a lot of the parents were against it, and a lot of the parents did not approve of marriages. An interesting thing for me is that when I met my future husband, and I introduced him to my parents, maybe because my father had worked in a larger community before he was married, but anyways, they had no problem. And plus the fact that he was studying to become an engineer. So I think the fact that he was moving into a professional job, I think may have helped, because my parents were totally accepting of him. So, and then his parents, his father was a major lieutenant colonel during the Second World War. And here his parents were totally agreeable. And so we were very lucky. And so we married without any problems. And my mother-in-law passed away soon after, never got to see her first grandson. But my father-in-law was an incredibly kind person. And he went back to Scotland after he retired and remarried there. We visited him in Scotland a couple of times with the kids and all that. And I never had any problems. So I was very, very lucky. And but the only thing that was lacking for me was that I still didn't know who I was. So therefore, eventually, after my kids were older, I left the marriage, and went on to educate myself. I went to universities and all that to find out who I am. and what I'm capable of. And so what you see me today is somebody who lived this incredible, almost stupid life, but I feel that at my age, now 88, I feel that I've done everything.